The mud of the trenches tasted like copper and ash. Elias Thorne, a 50-year-old combat medic whose hands had stitched together more torn cadets than he could count, pressed a glowing coagulant pad against a young soldier's severed artery. The boy was crying out for his mother, his voice a wet, gurgling rasp that barely cut through the deafening artillery fire overhead. Elias didn't offer false hope. He just pressed harder, his own breathing ragged, his knees sinking deeper into the blood-soaked soil of this doomed red-tier planet. In his normal life, before the Dalki invasion shattered the galaxy, Elias had been a civilian trauma surgeon, a man who believed that science, medicine, and human grit could solve any crisis. Now he was just a butcher trying to delay the inevitable. Humanity was meat, the universe was a slaughterhouse, and there were no miracles left in the dark. But what if the ultimate power in the multiverse, a force capable of shattering reality itself, didn't arrive with a grand prophecy or a conquering armada? What if a god simply took a wrong turn? Above Elias, the crimson sky tore open with the shriek of dying atmosphere. It wasn't a dropship. It was them, the Dalki. A shockwave of displaced air flattened the medical tent, throwing Elias backward into a pile of shattered, heavy plasma rifles. He scrambled to his hands and knees, his ears ringing with a high-pitched whine that drowned out the screams of the dying. Through the thick, swirling smoke, illuminated by the dying embers of a burning human settlement, Elias saw the monsters that had pushed humanity to the brink of extinction. At the center of the carnage stood a nightmare of scaled flesh and jagged bone. A 4-spike Dalki. Its obsidian scales gleamed with a sickening wetness, coated in the neon green blood of its own kind and the dark crimson of human defenders. The beast's chest heaved, its massive muscles bulging and twisting with every breath. With every wound it sustained, the creature only grew faster, stronger, and more infinitely cruel. Elias dragged himself behind the rusted husk of an overturned transport rover, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He watched, paralyzed by a cold, suffocating terror, as the last line of defense crumbled. 20 yards away, Quinn Talen, the vanguard of their desperate resistance, clad in the remnants of Emperor-tier beast gear, fell to his knees. The boy's armor, once a masterwork of defensive engineering, was now nothing more than jagged shrapnel digging into his own flesh. The shadow skills that usually danced at Quinn's feet flickered and died, starved of stamina and blood aura. Beside him, Vorden lay slumped against a cracked boulder. The elemental prodigy's hands were a ruined, bloody mess, trembling violently as he tried and failed to summon even a single spark of lightning. The smell of scorched ozone hung heavy in the air, a bitter reminder of their absolute failure. The 4-spiked Dalki threw back its head and unleashed a roar that physically vibrated through Elias's chest. It was a sound that defied nature, a predatory frequency that shattered the glass of nearby visors and forced Elias to clamp his hands over his ears. This was the sound of an executioner. The beast stomped its massive foot, sending a spiderweb of deep fissures racing across the baked earth. In a blur of motion that Elias's human eyes couldn't even track, the Dalki launched itself forward. It broke the sound barrier with a thunderous crack, its colossal fist drawn back, carrying enough kinetic energy to turn Quinn into red mist and pulverize the bedrock beneath him. Elias squeezed his eyes shut. He didn't want to see the boy die. He didn't want to watch the hope of humanity be extinguished in a spray of gore. He waited for the wet crunch of bone, the final, sickening impact that would signal the end of their world. Instead, he heard the sound of glass breaking. It wasn't a small sound. It was as if the sky itself was a massive pane of obsidian, and a sledgehammer had just been driven dead center into the atmosphere. Elias snapped his eyes open. The air directly above Quinn and the charging Dalki didn't just warp, it violently fractured. There was no warning klaxon from the orbital radar, no hum of crystal-powered spatial teleportation, no ambient glow of a magical portal. Reality simply tore open with a blinding golden brilliance that made Elias cry out and shield his retinas. A localized sonic boom hit the battlefield, carrying an atmospheric pressure so immense that it forced the breath from Elias's lungs. The shock wave swept outward in a perfect ring of devastation. It caught Quinn and Vorden, sending them tumbling like rag dolls across the dirt. But more impossibly, it caught the four-spike Dalki mid-strike. The unstoppable apex predator of the alien empire slammed into an invisible wall of pure kinetic force. The Dalki's momentum was instantly reversed. The creature shrieked as it was hurled backward over 100 yards, its heavy, clawed feet digging 2 deep, smoking trenches into the ground before it finally slammed into the side of a ruined watchtower. A massive cloud of pulverized rock and dust plumed into the air, plunging the immediate battlefield into a choking twilight gray. Elias lay flat on his stomach, gasping for air, trying to comprehend the sheer physics of what had just occurred. Nothing possessed the mass or the energy to repel a charging four-spike. Nothing. He stared into the swirling vortex of dust, waiting for the smoke to clear, expecting to see an experimental mech suit, or perhaps a hidden vampire lord who had finally decided to intervene. As the dust slowly began to settle, a silhouette emerged from the epicenter of the crater. It wasn't a towering beast. It wasn't a war machine. It was a man. Elias squinted, wiping a mixture of blood and sweat from his eyes. The stranger was of average height, wearing a bizarre, bright orange martial arts uniform that was heavily singed and frayed at the edges. His hair was a chaotic mane of thick black spikes that defied gravity. The man didn't look like a savior. He looked completely and utterly lost. He was rubbing the back of his neck, his face twisted in a look of mild annoyance. Elias strained to hear, catching the faint, casual muttering of the stranger. The man was complaining. He was actually complaining, amidst the corpses and the fire, about how trying to use instant transmission while chewing on a piece of roasted dinosaur meat had thrown off his energy signature, pulling him away from Lord Beerus's planet and dumping him into a place that smelled terribly of metal and rust. Elias's brain short-circuited. The sheer absurdity of the stranger's demeanor clashed so violently with the apocalyptic horror of the battlefield that Elias felt a hysterical laugh bubbling in his throat. But the four-spike Dalki felt no such confusion. It felt only the stinging humiliation of being swatted away by an inferior life form. The beast erupted from the rubble of the watchtower, its scales flaring, its eyes burning with a psychotic rage. The killing intent radiating from the creature was so thick it felt like physical heat against Elias's face. Quinn, battered and bleeding profusely from his mouth, forced himself up onto one knee. He screamed at the orange-clad stranger to run, his voice cracking with desperation. At the same time, Elias saw Quinn's eyes widen, glowing with a faint crimson light as the young vampire activated his system's inspect skill, desperately trying to gauge the newcomer's health, stamina, and beast gear. Elias couldn't see the system interface, but he saw the result. Quinn's face drained of all color. The boy stumbled backward, clutching his head as if he had been struck by lightning. He was murmuring wildly, his words drifting across the battlefield. He was speaking of system errors, of biological structures exceeding comprehension, of an energy source that shattered the boundaries of time and space. The system couldn't measure the man. It was blinding out in a sea of red warnings. And then the Dalki closed the distance. It didn't bother with a roar this time. It channeled all the explosive power of its mutated, four-spike biology into its right arm, aiming a devastating hook directly at the stranger's temple. The speed of the punch created a vacuum in the air, a localized implosion that dragged loose debris toward the point of impact. Elias flinched, bracing for the explosive decapitation. The sound of the impact was deafening, a sharp crack of displaced air that shattered the few remaining medical vials in Elias's belt. The ground beneath the stranger instantly vanished, collapsing into a massive, cone-shaped crater 30 feet deep. Boulders the size of transport ships were instantly pulverized into fine, floating dust by the sheer barometric pressure of the strike. But as the debris cleared, Elias's breath caught in his throat. His heart skipped a beat, then another. The stranger hadn't moved. He hadn't dodged. He hadn't even shifted his stance. The punch that could have breached the reinforced hull of a star cruiser was stopped dead in its tracks. The orange-clad man had caught the Dalki's massive, scaled fist in the palm of one single hand. The stranger didn't look strained. His arm didn't tremble. He simply blinked at the towering monster with wide, innocent eyes. The Dalki froze, its predatory mind utterly incapable of processing the physics of its own failure. The beast began to tremble, a deep primal terror vibrating down its spine. The stranger tilted his head, a friendly, almost naive smile spreading across his face. He complimented the beast on its striking power, casually noting that the creature's biology and its ability to grow stronger from damage reminded him of the Saiyans. But then the stranger's smile faded slightly, replaced by a look of genuine disappointment. He gently scolded the monster, telling it that bringing such heavy, oppressive malice into a fight completely ruined the joy of martial arts. Driven utterly mad by the casual dismissal, the Dalki bit down on its own lip. Neon green blood sprayed from its mouth, triggering a final desperate surge of extreme biological enhancement. It pivoted, turning its body into a weapon, and unleashed a lethal roundhouse kick aimed at the stranger's ribs. The orange-clad man simply let go of the fist and took a half-step backward. The kick missed by a fraction of an inch, the sheer velocity of the missed strike generating a crescent blade of compressed air that shot upward, cleanly slicing through the storm clouds gathering overhead. In response, the stranger raised his right hand. He didn't punch. He didn't block. He simply gathered a tiny, almost imperceptible spark of translucent energy at the tip of his fingers and flicked the Dalki squarely in the center of its chest. There was no blinding flash, only a low, resonant thud that felt like a heartbeat echoing through the earth. Elias watched, utterly paralyzed, as the kinetic force of that simple flick transferred perfectly through the Dalki's impenetrable scales. The beast was launched backward, not sliding across the dirt this time, but achieving immediate, violent liftoff. The four-spiked Dalki broke the sound barrier 3 times over as it was violently expelled from the battlefield, tearing a massive trench through the air itself before smashing straight through 3 jagged mountain peaks on the horizon. The distant rumble of collapsing stone rolled over the plains seconds later. The creature was gone, neutralized in a fraction of a second by a flick of a finger. The stranger sighed, rubbing his stomach and loudly complaining about how hungry he was. Elias tried to stand, his mind struggling to accept the new reality he had just witnessed. All his years of medical science, all his cynical beliefs about the cold, brutal hierarchy of the universe had just been rewritten. But before he could even take a breath, the ambient light on the battlefield vanished. The sky didn't just darken, it was eclipsed. A low, terrifying hum vibrated through the fillings in Elias's teeth. He looked up, his blood turning to ice. Tearing through the upper atmosphere was a Dalki dreadnought, a supercarrier the size of a small moon, drawn to the planet by the massive spatial anomaly the stranger had caused. The sheer gravity of the colossal warship caused the ruins around Elias to groan and shift. The belly of the ship opened, revealing a hangar bay from which thousands of elite Dalki warriors began to pour forth like a swarm of mechanical locusts. And leading them, dropping straight to the ground like a meteor, was a monster that made the 4-spike look like an infant. A 5-spike general, a planetary annihilator. The massive creature hit the earth, creating a shockwave that knocked Elias back down into the mud. The general didn't look at Quinn or Vorden. It didn't look at Elias. It locked its burning, hateful eyes on the orange-clad stranger and roared a command to the dreadnought above. Elias understood immediately. The super-heavy plasma cannons on the dreadnought began to glow with a blinding, radioactive red light. They were charging the main gun. They were going to glass the entire continent, incinerating the human outposts, the wounded, the medics, and every living cell on the surface, just to ensure this unknown anomaly was erased. Elias stared at his blood-stained hands, his heart sinking into an abyss of despair. The initial relief had been a cruel tease. He was surrounded by the corpses of hundreds of cadets he couldn't save. The colony was permanently lost, the infrastructure shattered beyond repair. And now, an entire fleet was seconds away from vaporizing them all. Elias looked up at the stranger, the only variable in this doomed equation. The man in orange had to do something completely impossible, or the next few seconds would be the end of them all. The crimson glow of the Dalki dreadnought's primary orbital cannon bled through the choked atmosphere, painting the ruined battlefield in the color of a fresh artery. High above, the supercarrier eclipsed the pale sun, its colossal metallic underbelly groaning with the stress of harboring a planetary extinction weapon. Elias Thorne lay flat against the vibrating dirt, his medical instincts cataloging the physical symptoms of his own impending death. His mouth was dry, his pupils dilated to their absolute limit, and his heart pounded against his ribs with the frantic, irregular rhythm of a failing engine. He knew exactly what was about to happen. He had treated the survivors of plasma glassing before, the few who had been on the extreme outer fringes of a strike zone. He knew that in less than 10 seconds, the temperature of the air would spike to a localized nuclear flashpoint. The oxygen would ignite, the moisture in their bodies would instantly flash boil into steam, and their flesh would be reduced to carbon shadows burned into the bedrock. There was no medical kit in the multiverse that could stitch a man back together after he was evaporated. The towering five-spike Dalki general, a creature of pure, unfiltered genetic malice, stood at the vanguard of its mechanized army. It threw its arms wide, its jaws unhinging, as it roared a command toward the heavens. It was a sound of absolute victory, a guttural frequency that rattled the remaining teeth in Elias's skull. The thousands of elite Dalki shock troops that had dropped from the ship's hangar bay began to slam their weapons against their armored chests in unison. The rhythmic, deafening clang of alien metal echoed across the wasteland, a terrifying war drum signaling the final execution of the human resistance on the Red Tier planet. Elias squeezed his eyes shut. He didn't want his final memory to be the apocalyptic red light. He reached out blindly, his trembling, blood-stained fingers finding the cold, motionless hand of the dead cadet beside him. He squeezed it, offering a silent apology to a universe that had proven, once and for all, that cruelty was the only true ruling force. The apex predator always won. It was simple, undeniable biology. "Man, this is getting really annoying," a voice complained. Elias opened his eyes. The voice hadn't boomed from the heavens, nor was it the battle cry of a desperate hero. It was spoken with the casual, frustrated tone of a man who had just missed his train. The stranger in the tattered orange gi was no longer smiling. The goofy, bewildered expression had completely evaporated from his face, replaced by a profound, terrifying stillness. The stranger planted his feet shoulder-width apart, his posture shifting from relaxed to perfectly, impossibly grounded. And then the air pressure on the battlefield simply ceased to exist. Elias gasped, his hands flying to his throat as his lungs struggled to pull in oxygen that felt suddenly completely devoid of substance. It wasn't just a drop in barometric pressure. It felt as though the fundamental gravitational constant of the planet had just been rewritten. A low, resonant hum began to vibrate from the stranger's body. It didn't sound like a machine or a weapon. It sounded like the tectonic plates of the earth grinding against each other. The dirt beneath the stranger's boots began to levitate. Tiny pebbles, shards of human armor, and the severed scales of the defeated Dalki slowly floated upward, defying gravity, suspended in an invisible, rising column of sheer kinetic pressure. The five-spike general stopped roaring. The rhythmic clanging of the Dalki army faltered, then died completely. The creatures of the Apex Empire, bred for absolute fearlessness, suddenly began to take involuntary steps backward. Their heavy, clawed feet dragged in the dirt. Their slit pupils dilated in sudden, alien confusion. They were reacting to a biological imperative they had never experienced before, the instinctual, overwhelming urge to flee. "I just wanted to get back in time for Boma's barbecue," the stranger muttered, his voice dropping an octave, echoing with a strange, layered resonance that made Elias's bones ache. "But you guys are really starting to ruin my appetite." The stranger clenched his fists and pulled his arms to his sides. He threw his head back and let out a single, earth-shattering shout. The universe exploded in gold. It wasn't just light. It was a physical impact. A geyser of blinding, furious golden energy erupted from the stranger, shooting straight up into the toxic clouds and violently tearing them apart. The force of the aura hit Elias like a physical shockwave, pinning him to the ground with the weight of a lead blanket. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't move. He could only watch in sheer paralytic awe as the stranger's jet-black hair violently snapped upward, turning a brilliant, incandescent yellow. The sheer luminosity of the aura cast harsh, razor-sharp shadows across the devastated landscape, momentarily washing out the apocalyptic red glow of the dreadnought above. But the visual spectacle was nothing compared to the physical pressure. The gravity in a 100-yard radius around the Golden Warrior magnified exponentially. Elias watched, his medical mind completely fracturing as the impossible happened. The elite Dalki shock troops, creatures whose dense musculature could withstand anti-tank artillery, began to collapse. They shrieked in agony as their legs snapped backward under the sudden, crushing weight of the Golden Warrior's spiritual pressure. Thousands of them were forced to their knees, their armor cracking, their neon green blood bursting from their tear ducts and mouths as the gravitational force crushed their internal organs. Even the towering five-spike general was driven to one knee, its massive arms trembling violently as it desperately tried to push against a force it couldn't even see. The monster's roar of defiance turned into a gargling choke as its ribs began to fracture under the unseen weight. Elias was safe only because he was behind the warrior. The aura seemed to possess a conscious direction, projecting its devastating pressure outward toward the enemy line, while leaving a narrow cone of safety behind it. Beside Elias, Quinn Talen was staring at the golden figure, his eyes wide and blank. Quinn's vampire system, the ancient and complex interface that governed his reality, had completely shut down. There were no more red error messages. The system had simply crashed, incapable of processing an entity whose power output was currently registering higher than the core of a dying star. High above, the Dalki dreadnought's artificial intelligence calculated the sudden catastrophic energy spike on the surface. Recognizing an existential threat, the ship bypassed its final charging sequence. The sky turned blood red as the orbital cannon fired. A beam of super-concentrated radioactive plasma, wide enough to swallow a sprawling metropolis, descended from the heavens. It moved with the speed of a falling meteor, a silent, roaring pillar of absolute annihilation, hurtling directly toward the Golden Warrior. The heat radiating off the descending beam was so intense that the ruined metal husks of the human transport rovers around Elias began to instantly liquefy, pooling into glowing puddles of slag. The Golden Warrior didn't look up. He didn't attempt to dodge. He simply lowered his center of gravity and cupped his hands together at his right hip. A sphere of pure, blinding azure light sparked into existence between his palms. The ambient sound of the battlefield, the shrieks of the crushed Dalki, the roar of the descending plasma, was suddenly drowned out by a high-frequency ringing. The azure sphere pulsed, violently drawing in the surrounding air, creating a localized hurricane that whipped Elias's coat around his face. "Ka," the warrior chanted, his voice incredibly calm, contrasting wildly with the apocalyptic storm raging around him. The blue sphere doubled in size. Me. The ground beneath him shattered, a perfectly circular crater forming instantly from the sheer recoil of the gathering energy. Ha! The blue light grew so intense it became painful to look at, casting an ethereal, ghostly hue over the panicked face of the Dalki general. Me. The red pillar of planetary destruction was less than a mile above them, its heat already singing the hair on Elias's arms. The air was burning. Ha! The warrior thrust his hands forward. A geyser of pure, concussive azure energy erupted from his palms. It wasn't just a beam. It was a roaring dragon of solid light. It tore through the atmosphere, moving so fast that it created a vacuum trail behind it. The blue Kamehameha collided directly with the descending red plasma beam of the dreadnought. There was no explosion. There was no struggle. The clash lasted for less than 1,000th of a second. The azure beam simply swallowed the red plasma. It drove straight up the center of the orbital strike, neutralizing and consuming the Dalki weapon's energy, converting it into its own mass. The blue pillar of light struck the underbelly of the supercarrier. The dreadnought's impenetrable void shields, designed to withstand the gravitational shear of a black hole, shattered like cheap glass. The Kamehameha punched clean through the miles-thick armor of the ship, detonating the central plasma core, and burst out through the top of the vessel. The sky ignited in a silent, expanding sphere of blue and white fire. The colossal Dalki warship, a vessel that had subjugated entire solar systems, was vaporized instantly. No debris rained down. The heat and kinetic force were so absolute that the ship and the tens of thousands of Dalki aboard it were reduced to subatomic ash. The azure beam continued its upward trajectory, violently blowing away the toxic, ash-choked storm clouds that had plagued the red-tier planet for years. It shot out into the deep vacuum of space, leaving a perfectly clear, circular window to the cosmos in its wake. On the ground, the backlash of the beam's launch tore across the plains. The five-spiked general and the thousands of elite troops who had been crushed by the gravity were instantly swept away, their bodies instantly incinerated by the residual heat of the azure energy, leaving nothing but scorched black shadows on the glassed earth. Then, absolute silence. The ringing in Elias's ears faded into a profound, heavy stillness. The deafening roar of war, the shrieks of monsters, the agonizing cries of the dying, it was all gone, replaced by a silence so deep it felt holy. Elias slowly, painfully pushed himself up onto his knees. The air was breathable again. It smelled heavily of ozone and charred earth, but the coppery scent of blood had been burned away. He looked up. Through the massive, perfectly circular hole in the atmosphere, he saw the stars. He hadn't seen the stars from this planet in over 5 years. They looked cold, distant, and utterly indifferent. The golden light faded. The stranger stood at the edge of the glassed crater, his hair dropping back down and returning to its normal, chaotic black state. The terrifying aura vanished, replaced once again by the casual, slightly dopey posture. The man stretched his arms above his head, letting out a loud, exaggerated yawn. Before Elias could even attempt to form a word, the fabric of space a few yards away from the stranger simply unzipped. A beam of iridescent, rainbow-colored light struck the ground, and from it stepped a figure that defied all logic. It was a tall, incredibly slender humanoid with pale blue skin, striking white hair, and a glowing halo hovering effortlessly around his neck. He wore elegant, regal robes and carried a long staff topped with a floating black orb. The being didn't look like a warrior. He looked like an aristocratic scholar who had just been deeply inconvenienced. "Honestly, Goku," the blue-skinned being sighed, his voice melodic but laced with mild irritation. He tapped his staff gently against the scorched earth. "I turned my back for one microscopic fraction of a second to check on Lady Bulma's marinades, and you managed to completely disrupt your instantaneous movement vector. Do you have any idea how far off the dimensional axis you drifted?" The stranger, Goku, rubbed the back of his head, offering a sheepish, apologetic laugh. "Ah, my bad, Whis. I got distracted. I swear I smelled something burning and thought the ribs were burning. Then I ended up here, and these weird, spiky lizard guys were being real jerks." Whis glanced around the apocalyptic wasteland, his eyes sweeping over the glassed earth and the faint, lingering shadows of the Dalki army. He didn't look horrified. He barely looked interested. "Yes, well, it seems you've severely altered the socio-political power dynamic of this localized quadrant. A bit heavy-handed for a slight detour, wouldn't you say?" "They started it," Goku protested, crossing his arms like a scolded child. "Regardless," Whis said, turning his back on the destruction and raising his staff. "The feast is almost ready, and Lord Beerus will be exceptionally foul-tempered if the beef gets cold. Come along." Goku nodded eagerly. He took a step toward the angelic being, then paused. He turned his head and looked directly at the spot where Quinn Talen was slowly trying to pull himself upright. The young vampire was battered, his armor gone, his body broken. But his eyes were locked onto the Saiyan with a mixture of absolute reverence and lingering terror. Goku smiled, a bright, genuine, and utterly unburdened expression. He raised his hand, flashing Quinn a thumbs up. "Hey," Goku called out, his voice echoing cleanly in the quiet wasteland. "You guys took a real beating, but you didn't quit. I can tell you've got a lot of hidden power locked away in there. Don't slack off. Keep training. Maybe we'll spar someday when you get stronger." With that, Goku stepped into the iridescent light beside Whis. The rainbow beam flared brilliantly for a fraction of a second, and then they were gone. The localized dimensional rip sealed itself seamlessly, leaving no trace that they had ever been there, save for the glassed crater and the decimated alien armada. Elias Thorne remained on his knees in the mud. He looked at the empty space where the gods had stood, and then he looked up at the clear, starry sky. The dread, the absolute certainty of extinction that had anchored his soul for years, was gone. But it wasn't replaced by joy. It was replaced by a terrifying, dizzying vertigo. The Dalki were not the apex predators of the universe. Humanity was not the most tragic victim. They were all just insects playing in the dirt, completely unaware of the titans that casually walked between the stars. The rules of survival had just been violently rewritten. The universe was infinitely larger, infinitely more dangerous, and for the first time in Elias's life, completely unpredictable. He looked over at Quinn, watching the young warrior stare at his own trembling hands, and Elias knew with absolute chilling certainty. The human race would survive today, but the price of this miracle would be a reckoning they could not even begin to fathom. The universe had noticed them. And what happens next, Elias thought, when the next god who takes a wrong turn isn't quite so friendly? The silence of the glassed wasteland did not last. It was broken first by the wind. The localized vacuum created by the Golden Warrior's ascending beam of sheer kinetic energy had punched a hole through the planet's atmosphere. Now the surrounding air masses rushed in to fill the void. A howling, unnatural gale swept across the scorched plains, carrying the bitter chill of the upper stratosphere and the choking scent of ionized ozone. Elias Thorne shivered, the cold biting through his sweat-drenched, blood-soaked uniform. He forced his numb legs to move, his heavy boots crunching against the fused silica of the earth. The ground was no longer dirt. It was a vast, sprawling mirror of black glass, smoothed to a terrifying perfection by heat that defied human comprehension. Elias dropped to his knees beside the first intact body he could find. It was a young cadet, her armor sheared in half, her face pale beneath a mask of soot. Elias's hands moved with desperate, practiced precision, his fingers pressing against her carotid artery. Nothing. He moved to the next shape in the rubble. A boy no older than 18, missing his left arm from the elbow down, his eyes wide and vacant, staring up at the newly revealed stars. Dead. Elias crawled frantically from body to body, his breath hitching in his chest, his medical bag knocking against his hip like a hollow drum. Out of a platoon of 200, he found only corpses. The miracle that had saved the planet had not been precise. It had not been gentle. It had simply erased the threat, indifferent to the fragile, broken things left bleeding at the edges of the blast zone. Dr. Thorne. The voice was raspy, dry as sandpaper, yet it carried an unnatural weight. Elias turned slowly. Quinn Talen stood at the edge of the glassed crater. The young vampire's ragged clothes whipped wildly in the freezing wind. His wounds were still bleeding, but the blood wasn't pooling. It was slowly, impossibly, drawing itself back into his veins. Quinn's eyes were no longer the desperate, terrified human eyes Elias had seen just minutes ago. The irises glowed with a deep, pulsing crimson light. It was the look of a predator that had just realized the cage it lived in was entirely an illusion. Elias stood up, wiping the grime from his face. "Talen, you need a coagulant. Your shadow skills burned out your capillary system. If you try to move too fast, your heart will tear itself apart." "I'm fine, Doc," Quinn whispered, though he didn't look at Elias. He was staring up at the massive, perfectly circular gap in the clouds. He raised his right hand, staring at his own palm, slowly curling his fingers into a fist. "Did you feel it? Before he fired that light, did you feel a pressure? It wasn't just physical force. It was life. Pure, overwhelming life force. A biological engine with no ceiling." Elias felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. The awe in Quinn's voice was terrifying. In that single moment, Elias realized the true casualty of the stranger's arrival. It wasn't just the Dalki armada. It was the fundamental concept of limits. Before today, the human resistance fought to survive. They fought to hold a line in the dirt. But the boy standing in front of him had just witnessed godhood. Quinn wasn't looking at the sky with gratitude. He was looking at it with absolute, terrifying ambition. The vampire system inside the boy, the ancient code that dictated his evolution, had been forced to witness an anomaly. And Elias knew with the cold certainty of a surgeon diagnosing a terminal disease, that Quinn would never stop until he figured out how to replicate that power. "Don't chase ghosts, kid," Elias warned, his voice hardening as he stepped closer. "That wasn't biology. That was an extinction event that happened to be wearing a face. We survived, we breathe, we go home, and we count our dead. That's the mission." Vorden, who had finally managed to drag his battered body out from beneath the cracked boulder, let out a harsh, barking laugh that dissolved into a violent coughing fit. He clutched his ribs, spitting a glob of bloody phlegm onto the black glass. "Go home? Duck, look around. The Dalki command structure in this entire sector just evaporated. Every sensor array from here to the Sol system just registered an energy spike that makes a supernova look like a matchstick. We aren't going home. Home is coming to us." As if summoned by the elemental prodigy's grim prophecy, the air above the battlefield began to hum. It wasn't the guttural, mechanical roar of Dalki warships, nor was it the reality-shattering crack of the Golden Warrior's arrival. It was a high-pitched, harmonic whine, the signature sound of human spatial fold technology. Elias tightened his grip on his medical bag, his knuckles turning white. 3 distinct points of light flared into existence 50 feet above the glassed earth. They expanded rapidly into shimmering, hexagonal portals. The wind howled to the open gateways, bringing with it the sterile, recycled scent of high-command starships. From the center portal, a massive, heavily armored dropship descended, its thrusters burning blue as it hovered just above the ground. But it was the figures stepping out of the flanking portals that made Elias's blood run truly cold. They didn't wear the battered functional armor of the vanguard. They wore pristine, tailored military dress uniforms, adorned with rows of glittering medals that had never seen mud. Flanking them were figures cloaked in absolute darkness, their faces obscured by featureless metallic masks, the elite shadow guard of the vampire nobles. This was the absolute zenith of human and vampire authority. The world leaders. The people who ordered boys like Quinn and Vorden to die on the front lines, while they orchestrated galactic politics from impenetrable fortresses. The ramp of the dropship lowered with a heavy hydraulic hiss. General Vance, the supreme commander of the Earth Defense Force, strode down the metal grating. He was a mountain of a man, his face a landscape of old scars, his cybernetic left eye whirring softly as it scanned the apocalyptic devastation. He didn't look at the scattered corpses of his cadets. He didn't look at the exhausted medic or the bleeding heroes. His synthetic eye remained fixed entirely on the miles-wide, perfectly circular crater and the atmospheric void above it. "Secure the perimeter," Vance barked. His voice was amplified by hidden subdermal speakers, echoing like thunder across the wasteland. "I want a complete particulate analysis of this glass. I want temporal echoes traced. I want the energy signature isolated and mapped. Now!" Dozens of elite scientists and heavily armed guards poured out of the dropships, deploying scanning pylons and setting up a mobile command perimeter within seconds. They moved with a ruthless, practiced efficiency, completely ignoring the dead. One of the science officers, wearing a sealed environmental hazard suit, marched directly toward Elias and shoved him aside to scan the ground beneath his feet. "Hey!" Elias shouted, his voice cracking with sudden, overwhelming rage. He grabbed the officer by the shoulder and threw him back. "There are dead bodies here. There are kids buried under this rubble. Get your medics out here. General Vance turned his head slowly. The cybernetic lens whirred, focusing tightly on Elias's face. The general's expression was completely devoid of empathy. It was the look of a man evaluating a broken tool. Dr. Thorne, your medical services are no longer required in this sector. Step down. My cadets are dead, Elias growled, his hands trembling with a fury he hadn't felt in decades. He took a step toward the Supreme Commander, ignoring the immediate, threatening hum of the Shadow Guard's weapons powering up behind the general. A Dalki dreadnought dropped on our heads. We called for orbital support for 40 minutes. Where the hell were you? We were calculating the tactical viability of a rescue, Vance replied smoothly, his tone chillingly bureaucratic. The planet was designated a lost cause, until 3 minutes ago, when our deep space arrays detected a concentrated energy discharge capable of neutralizing a dreadnought-class vessel in a single microsecond. Vance stepped closer, his massive frame casting a long, heavy shadow over Elias. The general's gaze shifted from the medic to Quinn and Vorden, who stood rigid, their muscles coiled tight despite their agonizing injuries. I don't care about the Dalki right now, Doctor, Vance said, his voice dropping to a dangerous conspiratorial whisper. The Dalki are a known variable. What just happened here is not. An energy source of that magnitude can end this war by tomorrow morning. It can dictate the terms of survival for the next millennium. Vance pointed a heavy, armored finger directly at Quinn's chest. You were at ground zero, Talon. Your beast gear is shredded. Your aura is depleted. But you are standing, which means you saw what fired that weapon, and you are going to tell me exactly how to acquire it. Elias looked at Vance, then back at Quinn. The young vampire's jaw was clenched so tightly it looked like the bone might shatter. Quinn knew the truth. He knew it wasn't a weapon. He knew it was a man who complained about missing a barbecue. But looking into General Vance's cold, hungry eyes, Elias realized a terrifying truth. If humanity's leaders discovered that a single being held that kind of power, they wouldn't ask for salvation. They would try to chain the god. They would try to dissect the miracle to build a better bomb. And in doing so, they would bring down the wrath of a universe that viewed them as nothing more than an annoyance. The Dalki had wanted to exterminate them. That was brutal, but simple. The men standing before them now wanted to steal fire from heaven, completely blind to the fact that it would burn the entire galaxy to ash. Elias's hands dropped to his sides. The adrenaline that had kept him moving finally curdled into a deep, sickening dread. The innocent, desperate camaraderie of the trenches was permanently dead. They had survived the monsters, only to be swallowed by the architects of the war. General Vance's guards moved in, encircling Quinn and Vorden with weapons drawn, leaving Elias standing alone on the outside of the ring. A choice was forming in the air, heavy and suffocating, and Elias knew that whatever Quinn said next would trigger a conflict far worse than any alien invasion. The oppressive weight of the standoff was a physical thing, thicker than the ash that still coated the devastated Red Tier plains. Elias Thorne could hear the high-frequency hum of the Shadow Guard's energy halberds charging up, a sterile, synthesized vibration that grated against his eardrums. These were weapons designed not to kill monsters, but to execute traitors. The 12 elite guards formed a perfect, tightening circle around the 3 survivors, their featureless, metallic masks reflecting the harsh, cold floodlights of the descending dropship. General Vance stood at the edge of this ring of executioners, a monument of bureaucratic tyranny carved out of cybernetics and tailored military fabric. He was not looking at the thousands of Dalki corpses or the miles of glassed earth. His synthetic eye, glowing with a faint, predatory red targeting reticle, remained fixed solely on Quinn Talen. Elias felt a sickening, hollow coldness bloom in his chest. In his previous life, Elias had believed that a shared enemy united humanity. He had believed that the Dalki invasion had burned away the petty greed of politicians, leaving only the pure, noble instinct to survive. He was a fool. The Dalki were just a localized weather event. The true apex predators of the galaxy wore perfectly pressed uniforms and spoke in the measured tones of military requisition. Elias's pulse hammered against his throat as he watched the shadow guards take another synchronized step forward. The sound of their heavy boots clicking against the fused glass was deafening in the unnatural quiet of the wasteland. Vorden, barely able to keep his eyes open, let out a low, feral hiss. The elemental prodigy raised his ruined, blood-caked hands, desperately trying to force his drained core to produce a spark. A pathetic, anemic flicker of blue static danced across his knuckles before sputtering out, leaving him gasping in agony. Quinn did not move. The young vampire stood perfectly still, his chin tucked down, his eyes hidden beneath the shadow of his blood-matted hair. He looked completely broken, a depleted battery waiting to be discarded. But Elias, standing just a few feet away, could hear the rapid, erratic thumping of the boy's heart. It wasn't the slow, rhythmic beat of a defeated soldier. It was the frantic, hyper-accelerated drumming of a caged animal, calculating the distance to the throat of its captor. Vance was demanding the secret to the Golden Warrior's power. He wanted to harness the azure light that had vaporized the dreadnought. He wanted to put a leash on a god. And Elias knew, with terrifying absolute certainty, that if Vance took Quinn back to the orbital torture labs, the boy would be dissected alive to extract a truth he did not even possess. Before the shadow guards could close the final gap, Elias threw himself forward. He didn't have a weapon, and his medical bag was virtually empty. But he positioned his battered, 50-year-old body directly between the Supreme Commander and the 2 exhausted youths. The sudden movement caused 3 energy halberds to snap toward his chest, the superheated plasma blades stopping mere inches from his uniform. The heat radiating off the weapons instantly singed the fabric of his coat, the smell of burning thread filling his nostrils. Elias raised his empty hands, his chest heaving, locking his human, desperately frightened eyes with the cold, mechanical stare of General Vance. He had to lie. He had to construct a fiction so dense and scientific that it would stall the military machine long enough for the boys to recover. "General, you are making a catastrophic tactical error," Elias said, forcing his voice to project over the hum of the weapons. "There is no asset to acquire here. What you witnessed was not a biological entity. It was a localized, anomalous cascade failure of the Dalki dreadnought's own plasma core, triggered by a hyperspatial rebound." General Vance did not blink. His organic eye narrowed, while his cybernetic lens whirred, adjusting its focal length to scrutinize the sweat dripping down the medic's terrified face. Do not insult my intelligence, Dr. Thorne. Orbital telemetry recorded a massive, centralized spike in biological life force, originating directly from these coordinates mere milliseconds before the dreadnought was neutralized. A biological entity fired a directed energy weapon of unknown origin, and Talen was standing at ground zero. Vance took a slow, deliberate step forward, the sheer mass of his armored frame looming over Elias like a collapsing building. We are losing this war, Doctor. Whole star systems are burning. If there is a weapon down here capable of glassing a 5-spike general and an entire armada, the Earth Defense Force will possess it. We will reverse engineer it. We will mass produce it. Now, step aside, or I will have you court-martialed and executed for treason on this very spot. The absolute callousness of the threat shattered the last remnants of Elias's faith in the command structure. They didn't care about the dead. They didn't care about the cost. They only cared about absolute supremacy. You can't reverse engineer what happened here, Elias yelled, his fear suddenly dissolving into a white-hot, reckless fury. It wasn't a weapon. It was a force of nature. You try to put a collar on that kind of power, and you won't just destroy the Dalki. You'll crack the foundations of the universe. You will get us all killed. He stood his ground, spreading his arms wider, effectively shielding Quinn from Vance's line of sight. It was a futile, human gesture. A man made of flesh and tired bones trying to stop a tidal wave of military-industrial greed. But he couldn't let them take the boy. He had stitched Quinn together too many times to watch him be torn apart by his own people. Vance's expression remained entirely flat. He didn't even bother to raise his voice. He simply flicked his wrist. The shadow guard closest to Elias didn't hesitate. The elite soldier pivoted, reversing his grip on the heavy plasma halberd, and drove the blunt, reinforced metallic butt of the weapon directly into Elias's sternum. The impact sounded like a dry branch snapping under a heavy boot. Elias's vision exploded into a blinding flash of white light. The kinetic force lifted him entirely off his feet, shattering 3 of his ribs and completely collapsing his left lung. He flew backward, slamming violently against the fused black glass of the crater. The air was violently expelled from his body in a wet, ragged cough. He lay there, paralyzed by a sudden, all-consuming agony, tasting the hot metallic tang of his own internal bleeding. He tried to speak, tried to warn them, but only a pathetic, gurgling wheeze escaped his lips. The world tilted sideways, the edges of his vision blurring into dark, encroaching shadows. He had failed. The old world of logic and medicine was dead, and he was dying with it. "Doc!" The scream tore through the wasteland, raw and jagged. It didn't sound human. It sounded like the shrieking tear of heavy metal. Quinn Talen's head snapped up. The young vampire's eyes were no longer just glowing crimson. They were burning with a terrifying, unstable luminescence. The memory of the Golden Warrior, the casual, unburdened freedom of a being who answered to no authority, who swatted away apocalyptic threats with a smile, collided violently with the sight of Elias bleeding out on the glass, struck down by the very people he had sworn to serve. The chains of duty, of rank, of terrified obedience to the vampire nobles and the Earth Defense Force snapped within Quinn's mind. Deep inside his consciousness, the crashed vampire system suddenly violently rebooted. The virtual interface did not display its usual clean, Gothic text. The letters were frantic, glitching, infused with an erratic golden code that the system had desperately tried to record during the Kamehameha blast. A massive blood-red notification flashed across Quinn's retinas. Critical error. Foreign energy signature detected. Attempting to assimilate residual Chi aura. Warning. Host biology incompatible. Fatal tissue damage imminent. Proceed? Quinn didn't hesitate. He mentally slammed the confirmation. The physical reaction was instantaneous and horrifying. The ambient shadows on the battlefield didn't just crawl toward him. They were violently sucked into his body, instantly vaporizing the remaining blood on his skin. A shockwave of pure, unrefined kinetic pressure exploded outward from the boy, a twisted, darkened mimicry of the Golden Warrior's aura. The sheer force of the sudden expansion knocked 3 of the heavily armored shadow guards off their feet. Quinn's muscles expanded, his veins bulging black against his pale skin. The aura surrounding him wasn't the clean, divine light of a Super Saiyan. It was a violent, chaotic maelstrom of deep crimson and jagged streaks of volatile, stolen gold. He let out a roar that carried no words, only the sheer, unadulterated fury of a broken weapon turning against its master. Before Vance could even register the spike in the boy's power level, Quinn vanished. There was no blur of motion, no sound of displacement. He simply ceased to be in one location and violently materialized in another. He appeared directly in front of the shadow guard who had struck Elias. Quinn didn't use a martial arts technique. He didn't use a refined vampire skill. He simply drove his fist forward, propelled by the unstable, agonizing mixture of blood aura and residual cosmic energy tearing through his cells. The punch struck the guard squarely in the chest plate. The advanced kinetic absorption armor, designed to withstand point-blank artillery, shattered like cheap porcelain. The guard was launched backward with the speed of a railgun slug, crashing through the heavy steel landing struts of the dropship and crumpling into an unrecognizable heap of twisted metal and bone. General Vance staggered back, his cybernetic eye spinning wildly as it tried and failed to track Quinn's erratic, impossible movements. "Open fire!" Vance roared, drawing a heavy plasma sidearm from his hip. "Kill the asset! Kill them all!" The remaining shadow guards recovered from the shockwave, leveling their halberds and opening fire. Dozens of searing, superheated plasma bolts tore across the localized space. But Quinn was moving with a desperate, suicidal speed. He wasn't dodging. He was moving through the shadows, teleporting erratically between the beams, leaving after-images of crimson and gold in his wake. Every time he materialized, a guard fell, their armor crushed, their weapons snapped in half. But the cost was catastrophic. With every burst of this hijacked energy, Elias could see the skin on Quinn's arms splitting open, spraying fine mists of blood into the air. The boy was literally tearing his own biological structure apart to wield a power he was never meant to hold. Vorden, realizing that Quinn was seconds away from burning himself out into a pile of ash, forced his broken body to act. He dragged himself toward the mobile command pylons the scientists had erected. Ignoring the searing pain in his shattered hands, he slammed his bloody palms against the central processing terminal. He didn't try to summon lightning to fight. He used the last pathetic dregs of his elemental core to interface directly with the dropship's navigational computer. He channeled his electrical affinity into the machine, violently overriding the encryption firewalls. Sparks showered over his face as the terminal overloaded. Above them, one of the hovering hexagonal spatial portals suddenly violently shifted color, turning from a stable, shimmering blue to a chaotic, tearing vortex of violet and black. "Quinn!" Vorden screamed, his voice cracking as the terminal exploded in his hands, throwing him backward. "The portal! It's unlinked! Go!" Quinn heard the shout over the deafening roar of weapons fire. He materialized next to Elias, moving so fast the air cracked behind him. He didn't gently pick the medic up. He grabbed Elias by the collar of his tactical vest, hauling the gasping, bleeding man over his shoulder like a sack of grain. He grabbed Vorden by the belt with his other hand. General Vance, his pristine uniform now dusted with the ash of his own shattered guards, leveled his heavy sidearm directly at Quinn's head. "You cross that threshold, Talon, and you are enemies of the human race. There will be no sanctuary. We will hunt you to the edge of the universe." Vance's voice was absolute zero, devoid of any bluff. Quinn paused at the edge of the destabilized, tearing portal. The chaotic violet light cast terrifying, elongated shadows across his bleeding face. He looked back at Vance, the stolen, volatile, golden energy flickering weakly in his crimson eyes. The boy who had spent his entire life following orders, fighting a war for leaders who viewed him as disposable meat, was gone. "You're already hunting us," Quinn spat, blood dripping from his chin. "You just didn't have the guts to say it." Without another word, Quinn hurled himself backward, dragging Vorden and the dying medic into the howling, unstable tear in space-time. The portal instantly collapsed behind them with a violent thunderclap, leaving General Vance standing alone on the glassed battlefield amidst his broken elite guards. Inside the spatial fold, there was no gravity, no sound, only the violently spinning, nauseating colors of a disorganized slipstream. Elias drifted in the chaotic void, the agonizing pain in his shattered chest slowly pulling him into the dark embrace of unconsciousness. But his mind was terrifyingly clear. He looked at Quinn, floating beside him, the boy's body covered in self-inflicted lacerations from wielding the forbidden energy. The bridge was burned. There was no command structure to report to, no medals to win, no reinforcements to call. They had struck a general of the Earth Defense Force. They had killed elite shadow guards. They were officially traitors, fugitives stripped of their humanity and their rank, cast out into an infinitely expanding, hostile cosmos. The rules of engagement were entirely obliterated. As the slipstream violently spat them out into the unknown dark, Elias realized the true horror of their situation. The next time they faced annihilation, they wouldn't just be fighting the monsters in the dark. They would be fighting the entire human race. The violently disorganized slipstream did not gently deposit them at their destination. It chewed them up and spat them out like unwanted gristle. The chaotic violet vortex collapsed with a thunderous, concussive boom, hurling the three fugitives across a cold, unforgiving surface composed of rusted iron and grated steel. Elias Thorne hit the deck with a sickening, wet crunch. The impact drove the remaining oxygen from his one functioning lung, sending a blinding, white-hot spike of agony through his shattered ribcage. He slid across the grating, leaving a thick, dark smear of arterial blood in his wake, before finally slamming against a heavy bulkhead. The world spun violently, a nauseating carousel of sparks, shadows, and the overwhelming scent of oxidized metal and stale, recycled air. He fought to keep his eyes open, his medical training coldly cataloging his own rapid deterioration. Hypovolemic shock was setting in. His extremities were going numb, a terrifying coldness creeping up his arms and legs as his failing heart struggled to pump blood through a network of severed vessels. He was dying. It wasn't a philosophical concept anymore. It was a rapid, physiological countdown ticking away in his chest. Through the haze of his fading vision, Elias tried to process their surroundings. The deafening silence of the vacuum had been replaced by the low, omnipresent thrum of massive, failing life support turbines. Flickering sodium yellow emergency lights cast long, sickly shadows across the cavernous space. They were in a hangar bay, but it wasn't a military installation. The walls were scarred with decades of industrial abuse, patched with mismatched plating, and exposed bundles of fiber-optic cabling that hung like exposed veins. Scattered across the deck were hundreds of makeshift tents constructed from thermal blankets and salvaged cargo tarps. They hadn't escaped to a hidden fortress. The erratic portal had dumped them into the belly of Series 9, an automated, deep-space asteroid mining colony that had been illegally repurposed as a sanctuary for war refugees. Men, women, and children, the collateral damage of the Earth Defense Force's scorched earth tactics against the Dalki, were emerging from their pathetic shelters. Their faces, gaunt from malnutrition and smeared with grease, stared at the bleeding fugitives with a mixture of raw terror and exhausted apathy. They were the forgotten castaways of a burning galaxy, and Quinn Talen had just brought the war directly to their front door. A few yards away, Vorden was violently retching, his elemental core completely destabilized by the spatial jump. He was clutching his temples, his fingers digging into his scalp as small, uncontrollable arcs of blue static discharged from his skin, singeing his clothes. But it was Quinn who commanded Elias's terrified attention. The young vampire had not recovered from his suicidal channeling of the stolen cosmic energy. He was down on one knee, his back arched in a posture of absolute, excruciating agony. The residual, hijacked golden aura was still fiercely fighting the crimson blood skills within his cellular structure. It was a war of incompatible physics taking place inside a teenage boy's biology. The golden light was literally cooking Quinn from the inside out. His skin was blistering, cracking open to reveal angry, glowing fissures of unstable energy, while his vampire healing factor frantically tried and failed to knit the flesh back together. Quinn let out a low, guttural scream, a sound of such profound physical torment that it made the surrounding refugees flinch and pull their children closer. He was a nuclear reactor undergoing an uncontained meltdown, and his containment vessel was cracking. "Talen!" Elias gasped, his voice a pathetic, gurgling rasp. He tried to crawl toward the boy, his fingers blindly scraping against the cold iron deck, but his left arm refused to obey. You have to purge it. Bleed it out. It's destroying your cellular matrix." Every word felt like broken glass tearing through his throat. Elias knew the boy's biology was unique, a complex amalgamation of human genetics and an ancient system. But no biological vessel could hold the residual kinetic force of a being who swatted dreadnoughts out of the sky. The golden energy was foreign, absolute, and utterly intolerant of the dark, parasitic nature of vampire blood. It was trying to purify Quinn by burning him to ash. Before Quinn could even register the medic's desperate advice, the ambient hum of the colony's life support turbines was violently drowned out by a sound that made Elias's blood run cold. It was the unmistakable, deep bass vibration of a military-grade spatial breach. The massive, reinforced blast doors at the far end of the hangar bay groaned as the localized gravity of the asteroid was suddenly warped. The external proximity alarms of Series 9 began to shriek, a deafening, rhythmic wail that bathed the hangar in strobing crimson light. The refugees panicked. A chaotic, stampeding wave of humanity surged toward the narrow access corridors, screaming and shoving, knocking over their own fragile shelters in a desperate bid to hide from the inescapable. The Earth Defense Force had not lost their trail. General Vance's command cruiser had tracked the temporal wake of their unstable portal, and it had arrived with the swift, merciless precision of a guillotine. The hangar bay's external comms array suddenly crackled to life, overriding the colony's internal speakers. General Vance's voice echoed through the cavernous space, amplified and completely devoid of humanity. Attention, Series 9 command structure. This is the Earth Defense Force flagship, Retribution. You are currently harboring 3 Class Alpha fugitives, designated as traitors to the human species and active threats to galactic security. You are completely surrounded. Our heavy plasma batteries are currently locked onto your primary oxygen reclamation vents. You have precisely 3 minutes to physically eject the fugitives through the main airlock. If you fail to comply, or if I detect any spatial fold engines powering up, I will classify this entire colony as a hostile Dalki sympathizer stronghold. I will vent your atmosphere into the vacuum, and I will burn the asteroid down to the bedrock. The clock starts now. The silence that followed the ultimatum was heavier than the gravity of a collapsed star. The remaining refugees in the hangar bay, perhaps 300 people who had been too slow or too weak to reach the access corridors, froze. They turned slowly, their hollow, terrified eyes fixing on Quinn, Vorden, and Elias. The calculation was brutal, instantaneous, and entirely primal. 3 strangers, or 300 innocent lives. The crowd began to move. They didn't have weapons, only heavy hydrospanners, rusted mining picks, and the desperate, violent strength of cornered animals. They formed a tightening circle around the fugitives, their faces twisted with a mixture of apologetic sorrow and murderous intent. They were going to tear the boys apart and throw their bleeding pieces out the airlock just to buy themselves another day of miserable survival. Elias lay in his own pooling blood, his vision tunneling into a narrow, dark corridor. The pain in his chest was fading, replaced by the terrifying, euphoric numbness of the final stage of hemorrhagic shock. He looked at the faces of the encroaching refugees. He didn't see enemies. He saw the people he had spent his entire life trying to save. He saw frightened mothers, trembling old men, and children who had never known a sky without warships. He understood them perfectly. He forgave them instantly. This was the cold, unyielding arithmetic of war. "Quinn," Elias whispered, the words bubbling through the blood in his mouth. Let them take me. You and Vorden, use the distraction. Find a maintenance shaft. Disappear." Elias closed his eyes, surrendering to the heavy, pulling tide of death. He was just a medic. He had lived his life by the oath to do no harm, and dying here to spare these innocent people the wrath of the EDF was the most profound medical intervention he could offer. No, the word did not echo from the walls. It vibrated directly within the marrow of Elias's bones. The medic forced his eyes open. Quinn had stopped screaming. The young vampire was slowly standing up, his joints popping and cracking as he forced his violently deteriorating muscles to obey. The golden light spilling from the fissures in his skin began to darken, tainted by a sudden, overwhelming surge of pure, concentrated malice. Quinn was staring directly at the ceiling, looking through the heavy steel plating, sensing the massive EDF cruiser hovering just outside the colony's fragile hull. Deep within the architecture of his mind, the crashed vampire system had not just rebooted, it had mutated. The incompatible cosmic energy had broken the system's safety protocols, unlocking a tier of ancient, forbidden abilities that had been sealed away for millennia because of their sheer, catastrophic cruelty. A massive pulsating notification projected itself into Quinn's retinas, glowing with a sickly violet-black luminescence. Systems override. Host biologically failing. A system foreign Kiora cannot be contained without massive vitality infusion. Requirement: immediate cellular reconstruction. Available pathway unlocked. The Crimson Domain. Blood harvest. Warning: this is an area of effect parasitic drain. All biological entities within the domain will be forcibly harvested for life essence. Proceed. Quinn looked down at Elias. The medic's skin was the color of dirty snow, his breathing reduced to shallow, erratic gasps. He was seconds away from brain death. He looked at Vorden, who was incapacitated, choking on his own blood. He looked at the 300 refugees, the innocent, terrified people closing in with makeshift weapons, completely unaware that General Vance was going to incinerate them anyway the moment he had what he wanted. Quinn had spent his entire journey holding on to his humanity. He had sworn to only feed on the guilty, to only drain the monsters, to never become the nightmare that humanity feared. But the old rules were dead. The Golden Warrior had shown him that absolute power required absolute freedom from consequence. General Vance had shown him that morality was a luxury the weak could not afford. To save his friends, to repel the annihilation waiting outside, he needed power. He needed a bridge to fuse the golden fire with his vampire blood. He needed life. And there was only one source available. Elias, despite his fading consciousness, saw the exact moment the boy's soul fractured. Quinn's eyes, previously burning with a mixture of pain and golden light, turned completely, bottomlessly black. A tear of pure blood rolled down his cheek, a final, silent apology to the universe he was about to violate. "I'm sorry," Quinn whispered, his voice echoing with the layered, terrifying resonance of an ancient predator. Quinn slammed both of his hands onto the iron deck. "System, execute Crimson Domain." The reaction was not an explosion. It was an implosion of reality. A shockwave of pure, absolute darkness erupted from Quinn, expanding outward in a perfect 300-foot radius, entirely engulfing the hangar bay. The emergency lights instantly shattered, plunging the space into a suffocating, unnatural gloom. Elias felt it immediately. It wasn't a physical pressure. It was a violent, agonizing tug on his very soul. The air suddenly smelled overwhelmingly of copper and dried roses. The 300 refugees, who had been charging forward with their weapons raised, stopped dead in their tracks. A collective, horrifying gasp echoed through the darkness. It was the sound of 300 sets of lungs simultaneously forgetting how to breathe. Beneath them, the iron deck began to glow with a complex, intricate magical circle composed of boiling blood. Filaments of crimson light shot upward from the floor, piercing the chest of every single refugee within the radius. They didn't scream. The system skill paralyzed their vocal cords and their motor functions. Elias watched, trapped in his own dying body, as the sheer horror of the forbidden skill unfolded. The life essence of the refugees was physically ripped from their bodies. The filaments of light acted as parasitic straws, drawing their vitality, their stamina, and their literal years of life, funneling it all directly into Quinn. The visual transformation of the victims was catastrophic. A young man, perhaps 20 years old, who had been wielding a wrench, dropped the tool as his skin instantly lost its elasticity, sagging and turning a sickly, translucent gray. His thick, dark hair turned violently white and began to fall out in clumps. A woman beside him collapsed to her knees, her muscles violently atrophying, her bones audibly groaning as osteoporosis set in within seconds. Quinn was not killing them. He was stealing their time. He was forcibly aging them by 50 years in the span of 5 seconds, draining their cellular vitality to fuel his own monstrous resurrection. The stolen life force slammed into Quinn's body like a tidal wave. The dark, parasitic energy collided with the residual, volatile golden key inside his cells. The resulting fusion was an abomination of physics and magic. The fissures in Quinn's skin violently snapped shut. His muscles expanded, tearing his clothes, radiating an aura that was no longer pure gold, but a terrifying, swirling mixture of bruised purple, violent crimson, and harsh, crackling yellow lightning. The pain of the meltdown was gone, replaced by an intoxicating, godlike euphoria. He was a walking singularity, fueled by the stolen youth of hundreds of innocents. And then the energy reached Elias. Quinn didn't just absorb the vitality, he redirected a concentrated stream of it into the dying medic. Elias felt the crimson filament pierce his chest. The agonizing cold of death was instantly banished, replaced by a searing, invasive heat. He screamed, his back arching off the floor. He could literally feel his shattered ribs violently snapping back into place, grinding against each other as the bone instantly regenerated. His collapsed lung forcefully expanded, drawing in a massive, ragged breath of air. The internal bleeding stopped, the severed vessels knitting together with terrifying speed. He was being healed, completely and flawlessly, but the medicine was poison. As Elias gasped for air, his vision clearing, he looked to his left. He saw the face of the young mother who had been standing near him. She was now an elderly, withered husk lying on the floor, her eyes milky with sudden cataracts, her hands trembling violently as she tried to reach for her child, who had also been reduced to a fragile, severely aged state. Elias realized with absolute, soul-crushing clarity what had just happened. His perfectly functioning heart, his restored lungs, his renewed strength, they were purchased with the stolen lives of these people. He had been saved by an atrocity. Quinn stood up. The aura surrounding him was so dense it warped the air, cracking the heavy steel bulkheads of the hangar bay just from ambient pressure. He didn't look at the field of withered, groaning husks he had just created. He couldn't afford to. The irreversible step had been taken, and the bridge was burned to ash. He raised his hand, pointing his index finger directly at the heavy blast doors that separated the colony from the vacuum of space. The corrupted, golden blood energy spiraled down his arm, concentrating at his fingertip into a sphere of volatile, crackling black and gold light. "Vance!" Quinn's voice boomed, carrying no need for comms equipment. The sheer sonic force of his artificially enhanced voice vibrated through the metal of the colony and projected directly into the hull of the EDF cruiser outside. "You wanted the weapon. Here it is." Quinn fired. The beam of corrupted energy did not just pierce the blast doors. It completely disintegrated them, creating a massive, howling vacuum breach. The beam shot out into the void of space, a spear of stolen life and cosmic rage, and slammed directly into the forward deflector shields of the Earth Defense Force flagship. The impact was silent in the vacuum, but the visual was apocalyptic. The cruiser's shields, designed to withstand sustained orbital bombardment, shattered instantly. The beam tore through the forward command deck, entirely severing the ship's primary weapons array and plunging the colossal vessel into critical systems failure. The hunter-killer ship, paralyzed and bleeding atmosphere into the void, immediately aborted its attack run, its emergency thrusters firing blindly to push it away from the terrifying anomaly it had just awakened. Inside the hangar bay, the emergency blast shutters violently slammed down over the breach, sealing the colony back into its pressurized state. The localized hurricane of the vacuum subsided, leaving only the sickening scent of ozone and the low, agonizing moans of 300 permanently crippled refugees. Elias Thorne pushed himself up to a sitting position. He was completely unharmed. His 50-year-old body felt stronger than it had in a decade. But as he looked at his own steady, blood-stained hands, he felt a revulsion so deep it threatened to tear his mind apart. He was a doctor. He had sworn to preserve life. And yet, he was breathing because a teenage boy had played God and harvested a crowd of innocents. He looked up at Quinn. The monstrous aura was slowly receding, but the boy's eyes remained that bottomless, terrifying black. The human compassion that had once anchored Quinn to his friends was gone, burned away by the necessity of survival and the intoxicating poison of absolute power. The Dalki were no longer their primary threat, and General Vance was only a symptom of a larger disease. The true horror was standing right in front of them. Elias sat among the withered, stolen lives of the refugees, his heart beating with a steady, stolen rhythm, and knew that the boy who had tried to save the world had just become the very monster they were all trying to escape. The cost of survival had been paid in full, and the debt could never, ever be washed away. The emergency blast shutters groaned with a tortured metallic shriek, sliding into place to seal away the silent, freezing vacuum of space. But they could not seal away the suffocating nightmare that had been birthed within the hangar bay of Series 9. Elias Thorne knelt on the cold, vibrating iron grating, his hands trembling violently as he stared at the woman lying before him. Just minutes ago, she had been a terrified, fiercely protective mother, wielding a rusted hydrospanner to defend her child. Now, she was an octogenarian husk, Her skin was the texture of dry, crumbled parchment, stretched impossibly tight over fragile, prominent bones. Her hair, once a vibrant, defiant brown, lay scattered on the oily deck in clumps of brittle, snowy white. Elias reached into his medical bag with the frantic, terrifying speed of a man trying to outrun reality. His fingers flew over vials of synthetic coagulants and heavy stimulant injectors, but his vast, encyclopedic medical mind slammed headfirst into an impenetrable wall of utter despair. There was no surgical procedure in the known universe designed to reattach stolen years. There was no intravenous drip, no matter how advanced the Earth Defense Force technology, that could replenish a drained and cannibalized soul. He placed two shaking fingers against her desperately thin neck. Her pulse was a pathetic, fluttering moth, seconds away from absolute stillness. She turned her milky, cataract-clouded eyes toward him, her toothless mouth opening to form a silent, agonizing question that Elias could not answer. Elias choked on a dry sob, his newly regenerated lungs burning with the intense, sickening guilt of a perfectly healthy breath. He had been healed by her execution. The monstrous thrumming vitality currently coursing through his own 50-year-old veins was a direct stolen transfer from the 300 withered, dying bodies groaning in the dense shadows around him. He was a doctor who had taken an oath to do no harm, and yet he was breathing entirely because a massacre had been committed in his name. Elias slowly pushed himself up from the deck, the unnatural, fluid vigor in his muscles mocking the catastrophic devastation of the innocents around him. He turned his gaze toward the center of the cavernous hangar. Quinn Talen stood exactly where he had unleashed the forbidden crimson domain. The young vampire's silhouette was completely obscured by a violent, chaotic storm of clashing energies. The pure, divine, incandescent golden light of the alien martial artist's ki was now permanently infected, swirling with thick, sickly veins of bruised purple and heavy, blood-red aura. The aura did not hum. It crackled and snapped with a sound like tearing wet meat and shattering glass. Quinn's eyes, fixed straight ahead, remained bottomless pools of abyssal black, completely devoid of the sclera or iris. Elias forced his legs to move, his heavy tactical boots crunching sickeningly over the discarded makeshift weapons of the aged refugees. He stopped exactly 10 feet from the boy, the sheer ambient heat and kinetic pressure of the corrupted aura instantly singing his eyelashes and drying the sweat on his face. "Look at them," Elias commanded. His voice was a jagged, raw whisper, yet it carried over the ambient, failing hum of the asteroid colony's life support. "Look at what you bought our lives with, Talen. Look at the price of your miracle." Quinn did not turn his head. His jaw was locked so tightly that the muscles in his neck looked like braided steel cables. His fists were clenched until the knuckles threatened to burst straight through his rapidly regenerating skin. "We are alive, Doctor," Quinn's voice vibrated. It was layered with a terrifying, unnatural resonance, echoing with the faint, stolen frequencies of the 300 victims he had drained. It made the fillings in Elias's teeth ache. The Earth Defense Force cruiser is paralyzed and bleeding atmosphere. The Dalki threat on the planet below is gone. We survived. I held the line. "You crossed the line," Elias roared, the sudden violent eruption of his anger surprising even himself. He stepped directly into the scorching, oppressive radius of Quinn's aura, refusing to be intimidated by the godlike pressure radiating from the teenager. He reached out and grabbed Quinn by the shoulder, his human hand burning against the volatile energy, and spun the boy around to face the sprawling field of dying husks. "You didn't hold the line, Quinn. You became the very thing we were fighting in the dark. This isn't military collateral damage. This is a harvest. You cannibalized innocent people." Quinn's black, void-like eyes finally met Elias's desperate, human gaze. There was no tears, no remorse, no hesitation in them. There was only the cold, terrifying arithmetic of a supreme predator who had peered into the absolute abyss and learned to speak its language perfectly. "The Golden Warrior," Quinn stated flatly, his corrupted aura flaring violently with every syllable, held enough power to completely ignore the rules of the universe. He could afford to be kind. He could afford to smile, because absolutely nothing in this reality could hurt him. "We are not gods, Elias. We are prey. The EDF wanted to dissect us. The universe wants to crush us. And today, I decided to stop being prey. I took what I needed to ensure we don't die on our knees." A few yards away, Vorden violently coughed up a lungful of ozone-tainted air and pushed himself up from the deck. The elemental prodigy took one look at the withered bodies surrounding them, his eyes widening in sheer, unadulterated horror. He stumbled backward, his hands glowing with erratic, panicked arcs of blue lightning. He looked at Quinn, the boy who had been his brother in arms, his closest confidant, and saw only an unrecognizable abomination. Vorden pressed his back against the cold steel bulkhead, terrified of the monster standing at the center of the room. The fellowship they had forged in the mud of the red-tier planet was completely, irrevocably dead, incinerated in the blast radius of Quinn's ascension. Before Vorden could find the words to speak, the physical architecture of the massive asteroid colony began to groan in agonizing, high-pitched protest. It wasn't the mechanical vibration of another human cruiser dropping out of hyperspace. The temperature in the hangar bay plummeted instantly, bypassing the freezing point entirely. The residual moisture in the air froze into microscopic ice crystals that drifted down from the ceiling like glittering diamond dust. The emergency sodium lights, which had been flickering weakly, died completely, leaving only the terrifying, corrupted glow of Quinn's aura to illuminate the sprawling dark. Elias felt his breath crystallize in his throat. The shadows cast by the broken mining machinery didn't just lengthen. They actively detached themselves from the floor. They slithered upward, defying gravity, weaving together to form a massive, monolithic archway of absolute, impenetrable darkness in the exact center of the room. The metallic scent of ozone and the coppery tang of Quinn's atrocity was suddenly and violently overwritten by a suffocating stench. It smelled of ancient, stagnant blood, damp crypt dust, and centuries of calculated cruelty. The Earth Defense Force had tracked the mathematical wake of a spatial anomaly. But the entities stepping through this portal of living shadow had tracked something far more potent. The undeniable, cosmic scent of the forbidden crimson domain. They were the true apex predators of the hidden world, the silent, ancient architects of the war itself. The Vampire High Council had arrived. 3 figures emerged from the absolute black, their footfalls completely silent against the iron grating, as if reality itself was too terrified to register their weight. They did not wear military uniforms, nor did they wear the functional combat armor of the vanguard. They were draped in immaculate, sweeping robes of deep crimson and obsidian velvet, garments that seemed to actively drink in the scant light around them. At the center stood the First Lord. He was a being of such terrifying antiquity that his pale skin was practically translucent, revealing the dark, dormant, black-blooded veins beneath. His eyes were not the glowing, feral red of a common vampire or a noble. They were a piercing, luminous, liquid silver that cut through the darkness like perfectly sharpened scalpel blades. The First Lord did not look at the crippled, sparking EDF cruiser visible through the reinforced viewport. He did not spare a single fleeting glance at the 300 dying human husks littering the floor of the hangar. To him, the human refugees were nothing more than discarded, empty wrappers from a thoroughly consumed meal. His silver eyes locked entirely onto Quinn. Specifically, the ancient vampire stared with ravenous hunger at the chaotic, violent mixture of golden ki and blood aura that chained the boy's tearing muscles together. The First Lord smiled, a slow, predatory, terrifying curving of the lips that revealed fangs like polished, ancient ivory. "Magnificent," the First Lord whispered. His voice was soft, intensely melodic, and perfectly cultured, yet it carried a concussive, telepathic weight that struck Elias like a physical blow. The medic was driven back to his knees, blood instantly weeping from his nose and ears as his human brain struggled to process the sheer psychic pressure radiating from the ancient creature. For 10,000 years, the First Lord spoke, slowly raising a pale, impossibly elegant hand toward the frozen ceiling. The Council has meticulously monitored the bloodlines. We have waited in the dark for a mutation capable of breaking the biological ceiling of our stagnant species. We engineered the Dalki War to cull the weak from the herd. We allowed the human military to build their pathetic fleets and their laser cannons merely to serve as a whetstone for our inevitable evolution. And yet, the ultimate catalyst was not born from our careful, centuries-long breeding programs. The First Lord lowered his gaze back to Quinn, his silver eyes flashing with a sudden, overwhelming, apocalyptic greed. You witnessed the anomaly on the Red Tier planet. You absorbed the residual kinetic radiation of a divine entity. And most importantly, little one, you possessed the absolute, beautiful cruelty to cannibalize a human herd to anchor that divine fire to your soul. You are no longer a mere soldier in our shadow war, Talen. You are the ultimate vessel. The 2 heavily armored vampire lords flanking the First Lord drew their weapons simultaneously. They were not energy halberds. They were massive, jagged blades, forged from pure, solidified shadow, the weapons actively drinking in the ambient cold of the room. The First Lord took a single, deliberate step forward. The sheer, terrifying gravitational pressure of his presence warped the iron deck beneath his velvet slippers, leaving a perfect, depressed footprint in the reinforced steel. "Submit to the High Council," the First Lord commanded, the telepathic weight of his words threatening to crush Elias's skull. "Surrender the golden blood to my veins, and I will elevate you to the right hand of the eternal throne. We will scour this galaxy of the human vermin and the Dalki brutes alike. Resist, and my guards will peel the flesh from your stubborn bones, and I will extract the anomaly from your marrow while you scream." The sheer, unfathomable scale of the betrayal crashed over Elias like an ocean wave of ice water. The entire galactic war was a lie. The millions of human soldiers dead in the mud, the glassed planets, the endless, paralyzing terror of the Dalki invasion. It was all an orchestrated, meticulously managed meat grinder, designed by the Vampire Council to force a biological evolutionary leap. Humanity was nothing but ignorant cattle bred for a cosmic slaughterhouse, fighting a war that had been rigged from the very first shot. Quinn stood completely rigid. The corrupted aura around him flared violently, his stolen vitality burning at a terrifyingly accelerated rate, just to physically resist the First Lord's telepathic crushing weight. The boy was powerful, a walking, unstable nuclear reactor of stolen human time and divine radiation. But he was facing an entity that had consumed entire civilizations before humanity had even discovered the wheel. Elias wiped the hot blood from his upper lip, his perfectly healed, stolen heart hammering against his ribs. The human medic understood the horrific, inescapable reality of the moment. If the First Lord consumed Quinn's hijacked energy, the galaxy wouldn't just be subjugated by a military force. It would be plunged into an eternal, inescapable darkness, ruled by an immortal, invincible god of blood. The horrific cost of their survival had brought them to the absolute edge of the abyss. Elias looked at the boy who had damned his own soul to save them, and knew that the only way forward was to push the monster deeper into the fire. There was no retreating. There was no surrender. There was only the inevitable, apocalyptic clash of titans, and humanity was permanently trapped directly in the blast radius. The sheer, crushing, telepathic weight of the First Lord did not simply press against the physical body. It invaded the architecture of the human mind like a localized, weaponized gravity. Elias Thorne knelt on the cold iron grating of the hangar deck, his newly regenerated, perfectly functioning lungs seizing violently in his chest. Every instinct, honed by decades of medical trauma surgery, screamed at him to run, to administer a neuroblocker, to somehow sever the connection between his brainstem and the paralyzing terror radiating from the ancient vampire. But his muscles were completely locked, suspended in a state of absolute synthetic rigor mortis, dictated by a predator older than human civilization. The silence in the cavernous space was deafening, a thick, suffocating blanket that swallowed the ambient hum of the failing life support turbines and the erratic, terrified thumping of Elias's own stolen heartbeat. He could hear the blood rushing through his carotid arteries, a frantic, rushing river of vitality that had been brutally harvested from the 300 withered husks lying in the shadows around him. It was a horrifying symphony of biology held entirely hostage by a creature who viewed the entirety of human existence as nothing more than a carefully curated vineyard waiting for the harvest. Elias's medical mind, desperate to find an anchor in the storm of impossible physics, tried to categorize the First Lord's power. It wasn't the raw, explosive kinetic energy of the Golden Warrior who had shattered the red-tier sky, nor was it the desperate, agonizing, biological meltdown of Quinn's stolen key. This was a refined, absolute mastery over the fundamental essence of life itself. The First Lord did not need to throw a punch to shatter a spine. He merely needed to suggest it to the marrow. The translucent, pale skin of the ancient being seemed to actively absorb the scant, flickering light of the hanger, while his silver, luminous eyes cut through the gloom with the precision of surgical lasers. Elias realized with a sickening, hollow certainty that the Vanguard, the Earth Defense Force, and the Dalki armadas were all just moving parts in a cosmic terrarium. The war that had claimed millions of human lives, the desperate triage tents, the amputations, the agonizing screams of dying cadets. It was all a mathematically precise culling designed by the Vampire Council to force a stress-induced mutation in their own bloodlines. Humanity had never been fighting for survival. They had been dying on cue to serve as the catalyst for a god's ascension. Quinn Talen, the boy who had just damned his own soul to buy their survival, did not bow to the telepathic gravity. The violent, chaotic storm of clashing energies surrounding the young vampire, the pure, incandescent gold of the alien key violently mutating against the deep, parasitic crimson of the forbidden blood magic, flared with a sudden, localized sonic boom. The iron deck beneath Quinn's boots instantly buckled and liquefied into glowing orange slag from the sheer ambient heat of his defiance. "You orchestrated the slaughter of my entire world," Quinn's voice vibrated, projecting a terrifying, layered resonance that carried the ghostly, stolen frequencies of the 300 harvested refugees. The sound was a jagged, raw frequency that forced the two heavily armored vampire lords flanking the ancient master to subtly shift their stances. "You bred us in the mud, you watched us burn, and now you want to steal the only fire we managed to pull from the ashes. I am not your vessel. I am the executioner you built by mistake." The First Lord's predatory smile did not waver. It simply stretched wider, revealing a set of perfectly uniform, polished ivory fangs that gleamed with centuries of dark, calculated violence. He did not issue a verbal command. He merely lowered his impossibly elegant, pale hand a fraction of an inch. Instantly, the two armored vampire lords moved. There was no blur of motion, no displacement of air, and absolutely no sound of footfalls against the metal grating. They simply ceased to exist beside their master and violently materialized on either side of Quinn. Their weapons, massive, jagged broadswords forged from pure, solidified, hyper-condensed shadow, drank the ambient heat from the air, plunging the immediate vicinity into a flash freeze. The blades descended toward Quinn's neck and waist simultaneously, carrying enough localized gravitational force to cleanly sever the reinforced hull of a dreadnought. Before the shadow blades could make contact, the corrupted key inside Quinn reacted with the instinct of a cornered cosmic beast. The young vampire didn't attempt to block or parry the ancient weapons. He violently expanded his aura. A concussive, spherical shockwave of bruised purple and crackling yellow lightning erupted from his center, moving at a velocity that shattered the sound barrier within the confined space of the hangar. The impact was an apocalyptic collision of alien kinetic energy and ancient blood magic. The shadow blades, designed to absorb and nullify physical force, completely shattered into millions of jagged, dissipating fragments of black glass. The sheer, unadulterated physical pressure of the golden radiation hit the two ancient guards like a runaway meteor. their impenetrable armor crumpled inward, their ribs instantly pulverizing into fine dust as they were launched backward with terrifying, bone-shattering speed, crashing through the heavy steel bulkheads and disappearing into the dark, ruined corridors of the mining colony. Elias gasped, his vision swimming as the immediate shockwave temporarily disrupted the First Lord's telepathic hold. He watched in absolute, terrifying awe as the teenager stood unharmed in the center of the cratered deck. The power Quinn wielded was catastrophic, a literal force of nature chained to the volatile emotions of a traumatized boy. But the First Lord did not look at the massive, smoking holes where his elite guards had been hurled. He didn't even blink. He merely sighed, a sound of profound, aristocratic disappointment. "Brute force," the First Lord murmured, his melodic voice cutting effortlessly through the deafening ringing in Elias's ears. The crude, unrefined thrashing of an infant who has accidentally discovered a loaded weapon. "You possess the energy of a god, little one, but you are still bound by the pathetic, liquid biology of your mortal form. And biology belongs entirely to me." The First Lord raised his right hand, his silver eyes flashing with a sudden, blinding luminescence. He didn't target the golden key. He targeted the foundation, holding it all together. He reached out with his mind and seized the stolen parasitic blood magic coursing through Quinn's veins. Elias, watching from his knees, saw the physiological horror unfold in real time. The violently swirling aura around Quinn suddenly stuttered, the golden light flickering and dimming as the deep crimson veins of blood magic actively rebelled against their host. The First Lord was reversing the polarity of the crimson domain. He was turning the stolen life force of the 300 refugees, the very vitality keeping the alien radiation from incinerating Quinn, into a biological weapon inside the boy's own cardiovascular system. Quinn let out a horrific, gargling scream, dropping to his knees. The veins on his neck and arms bulged, turning a sickening, necrotic black as the blood within them literally reversed its flow, violently fighting the rhythm of his own heart. The golden key, losing its stabilizing anchor, immediately began to aggressively cook his internal organs. Searing, blinding rays of golden light began to shoot out from Quinn's tear ducts, his mouth, and the pores of his skin. He was undergoing a catastrophic, uncontained nuclear meltdown, entirely orchestrated by a creature who was merely clenching his fist from 30 feet away. The First Lord was casually, methodically peeling the stolen godhood away from the boy, preparing to drink the refined energy the moment the mortal vessel completely shattered. Vorden, realizing his best friend was seconds away from detonating and taking the entire asteroid colony with him, forced his drained, battered body to move. The elemental prodigy let out a raw, desperate battle cry, charging directly at the First Lord. He channeled the absolute last pathetic dregs of his elemental core, his ruined hands sparking with erratic, anemic arcs of blue lightning. He didn't aim for the ancient vampire. He aimed for the iron deck beneath him, attempting to violently magnetize the plating to disrupt the First Lord's stance. But before Vorden could even close half the distance, the First Lord simply flicked his silver eyes toward the charging youth. A localized spike of telekinetic pressure slammed into Vorden's chest, hitting him with the force of a speeding maglev train. Vorden's ribs cracked audibly as he was hurled violently backward, sliding across the blood-slicked grating and slamming into a rusted cargo container, instantly losing consciousness. Elias Thorne watched the two greatest heroes of his world fall in a matter of seconds. The raw, terrifying realization settled into his bones. Power, no matter how absolute, meant nothing without the structural discipline to control it. Quinn had the fire of a god, but the First Lord possessed the ancient, unbreakable blueprint of the universe. Elias looked down at his own hands. They were steady. They were strong. They were coursing with the exact same stolen, parasitic vitality that was currently tearing Quinn apart. The First Lord was using a harmonic, telepathic resonance to control the blood magic in the room. He was treating the biological matter like a closed, perfect liquid circuit. Elias was a doctor. He knew that the only way to destroy a perfect, synchronized biological circuit was to introduce an unpredictable, massive physiological shock. He couldn't fight the god of blood, but he could absolutely ruin the monster's concentration. With the frantic, suicidal speed of a man who had already accepted his own damnation, Elias ripped open his medical bag. He bypassed the coagulants and the painkillers, his fingers closing around a heavy, military-grade auto-injector. It was a Class X combat stimulant, a chemical cocktail of pure synthetic adrenaline and localized neuroamphetamines, designed to keep a soldier's heart beating even if their lower torso was blown away. It was a drug that, in a healthy, resting human, would cause instantaneous, catastrophic cardiac arrest. Elias didn't hesitate. He didn't aim the injector at Quinn to help him, nor did he foolishly attempt to charge the First Lord. Elias Thorne, the 50-year-old trauma surgeon, slammed the heavy metal needle directly through his own tactical vest and deep into his own chest, plunging the massive dose of synthetic adrenaline straight into his stolen, hyper-accelerated heart. The chemical reaction was instantaneous and violently apocalyptic. Elias's eyes rolled back in his skull as a white-hot, agonizing inferno exploded within his chest cavity. His perfectly functioning, magically regenerated heart instantly spiked to over 300 beats per minute, pumping the stolen, parasitic blood through his veins at a pressure that threatened to rupture every capillary in his body. Because he was tethered to the same dark, magical resonance that the First Lord was currently manipulating to torture Quinn, Elias's massive, chemically induced physiological spike acted like a catastrophic power surge in a delicate electrical grid. The deafening, erratic, screaming rhythm of Elias's drug-addled heartbeat violently collided with the First Lord's perfect telepathic control. The First Lord staggered. For the first time in perhaps 5,000 years, the ancient vampire physically lost his footing. His pale, elegant hand twitched violently, and his luminous silver eyes widened in sudden, profound shock. The absolute harmonic resonance he had established over the blood magic in the hangar bay was violently shattered by the screaming, chaotic interference of a human heart pumped full of military amphetamines. The psychic feedback loop hit the ancient creature like a physical blow to the temple, severing his telepathic grip on Quinn's cardiovascular system. Elias collapsed onto the grating, violently seizing, blood pouring from his nose and eyes as his body fought to contain the chemical fire. But his terrifying, reckless gambit had worked. He had bought the boy exactly 1 microsecond of freedom. Quinn did not waste the breath that Elias had purchased with his own life. The moment the crushing, reversing pressure on his blood lifted, the young vampire, slammed his hands into the iron deck. He didn't try to separate the alien key from the blood magic. He realized that survival meant fully embracing the abomination he had become. He violently forced the pure incandescent gold of the alien radiation to permanently fuse with the dark parasitic crimson of the harvested life force. The two incompatible energies screamed in physics-defying protest, twisting and braiding together into a single terrifying beam of absolute catastrophic destruction. The aura surrounding Quinn shrank, hypercondensing into a localized singularity of black and gold that warped the very light in the hangar bay, pulling the shadows toward him like a dying star. The structural integrity of the Series 9 mining colony began to completely fail. The massive steel girders supporting the ceiling groaned and buckled, snapping under the sheer gravitational pull of the condensed energy. Emergency klaxons, previously silenced by the First Lord's presence, began to shriek erratically as the localized space-time around Quinn literally began to tear at the seams. "First Lord!" Quinn roared, his voice no longer a layered echo, but a singular, deafening frequency that shattered the reinforced viewports separating the hangar from the vacuum of space. Quinn thrust his hands forward, mimicking the exact stance of the Golden Warrior, but unleashing a nightmare born entirely of human trauma and vampire cruelty. A geyser of pure black and gold, corrupted kinetic plasma erupted from his palms, moving at a speed that completely defied measurement. The First Lord, still reeling from the physiological feedback loop Elias had forced upon him, had only a fraction of a second to raise his arms and manifest a shield of hyperdense, ancient shadow. But the corrupted beam did not care for ancient magic. It possessed the sheer, blunt force kinetic radiation of the alien god, perfectly fused with the absolute, life-draining parasitism of the Crimson Domain. The beam slammed into the First Lord. The resulting explosion did not create fire. It created a localized void of sensory deprivation. For 3 full seconds, there was no sound, no light, no gravity. Just the terrifying, absolute pressure of an immovable object being violently pulverized by an unstoppable force. When reality violently snapped back into place, the entire far wall of the massive hangar bay had been completely eradicated. In its place was a gaping, jagged maw leading directly into the cold, indifferent vacuum of deep space. The First Lord was not dead, but his perfect, ancient composure was permanently shattered. The left half of his immaculate velvet robes was burned away, and his translucent, pale skin was heavily scorched, leaking thick, viscous black blood onto the deck. The ancient god of the vampires had been physically wounded by a mongrel child wielding stolen fire. But the victory was entirely Pyrrhic. The violent decompression of the hangar bay immediately began to drag everything: the debris, the withered husks of the refugees, and the unconscious bodies of the heroes, toward the black void. Elias Thorne clung desperately to a bolted iron stanchion, his chemically overloaded heart threatening to burst with every beat, his legs whipping violently in the howling, freezing hurricane of the vacuum breach. He looked at Quinn, who was standing at the edge of the abyss, his body smoking, his eyes completely hollowed out by the monstrous energy he had just wielded. The boy had matched the god of blood, but in doing so, he had completely destroyed the sanctuary, permanently weaponized his own soul, and plunged them all into a catastrophic freefall. The colony was tearing itself apart. There was no more running. There was no more hiding. The final, inescapable confrontation was no longer a battle for the fate of humanity. It was a desperate, apocalyptic scramble for survival in the dying breath of a shattered world. And Elias knew that whoever walked away from this collapsing asteroid would be a monster far worse than the ones they had originally feared. The howling hurricane of the vacuum breach tore through the hangar bay like an invisible, freezing leviathan. Elias Thorne clung to a bolted iron stanchion with arms that felt like they were packed with shattered glass. His chemically overloaded heart hammered a frantic, dying rhythm against his ribs, the synthetic adrenaline burning the absolute last reserves of his stolen vitality. Debris, crates, and the discarded tools of the aged refugees flew past him, sucked out into the infinite, indifferent black of deep space. Beyond the jagged maw of the torn bulkhead, suspended effortlessly in the freezing void, the first lord of the vampires floated. The ancient creature was no longer a picture of immaculate aristocratic grace. His translucent face was charred, his velvet robes torn, and thick, boiling black blood drifted from his wounds in perfect, zero-gravity spheres. But his silver eyes burned with a hatred so absolute it threatened to ignite the vacuum itself. He raised his pale hands, gathering a colossal, crushing sphere of pure, condensed shadow, intending to collapse the entire Series 9 asteroid into a tomb of compressed rock and frozen meat. Elias closed his eyes, his grip slipping from the frost-covered metal. He had played his final hand. He had injected the poison, broken the telepathic hold, and bought them a fleeting second. Now it was over. No, the voice was not a roar of monstrous fury. It was calm. It was remarkably, terrifyingly human. Elias forced his eyes open against the tearing wind. Quinn Talen stood at the precipice of the abyss, the toes of his boots hooked beneath the iron grating. The violent, chaotic maelstrom of bruised purple and heavy red aura that had possessed him was shifting. The memory of the golden warrior from the Red Tier planet, the casual smile, the unburdened thumbs up, the absolute purity of a strength that existed solely to protect, flashed through Quinn's mind. The teenager realized that if he let the stolen parasitic blood magic completely consume his soul, he would become nothing more than a younger, angrier version of the ancient monster floating outside. To truly win, he had to master the horrific cost he had incurred. He had to be the master of the fire, not its fuel. Quinn closed his eyes, took a deep, centering breath of the thinning oxygen, and forcefully synchronized the beating of his own heart with the erratic, stolen golden key in his cells. The sickening black and red aura violently fractured, shattering like a shell of dirty glass. From the cracks, a pure, incandescent, blinding crimson gold light erupted. It was a perfect, stable fusion. He had taken the biology of a predator and infused it with the spirit of a guardian. Quinn did not wait for the First Lord to unleash the crushing shadow. The young vampire bent his knees and launched himself directly into the vacuum of space, leaving a crater of melted iron behind. He moved with a speed that the ancient vampire's millennia-old eyes simply could not track. In the absolute silence of the void, there was no sound of the impact, only a catastrophic visual implosion. Quinn struck the First Lord dead center in the chest with a fist wrapped in compressed, stabilized, crimson-gold kinetic energy. The sheer barometric force of the blow, fueled by the stolen time of 300 souls and the residual radiation of a god, completely shattered the ancient vampire's defensive shadow barrier. The First Lord's ribcage caved in with a sickening, silent snap. His silver eyes widened in absolute, unprecedented terror as the pure kinetic force tore through his immortal biology. The ancient god of blood did not die, but his physical form was violently pulverized, reduced to a shrieking, dissipating cloud of black mist that instantly retreated into a deep space dimensional fold to avoid total eradication. The apex predator of the galaxy had been broken, routed by a human child who refused to kneel. Suspended in the void, Quinn twisted his body, aiming his hands back toward the gaping wound in the Series 9 colony. He didn't fire a weapon of destruction this time. He unleashed a wide, sweeping torrent of heavy, superheated blood aura, mixed with the fusing heat of the golden key. The energy struck the jagged, torn steel of the bulkhead, instantly melting the metal and forcefully weaving it together with crystallized, impenetrable layers of magical blood iron. The massive breach sealed shut in a matter of seconds, locking the freezing vacuum out and trapping the remaining atmosphere inside. The howling wind instantly died. The terrifying pull of the void vanished. Inside the hangar, Elias Thorne collapsed onto the iron grating, his chest heaving as he drew in deep, desperate lungfuls of stale, life-saving air. The erratic, chemically induced thumping in his chest slowly, miraculously, began to subside, the stolen vitality within him stabilizing his failing human organs. He was alive. Quinn dropped heavily onto the deck from the newly fused, glowing red bulkhead. The incandescent crimson-gold aura faded entirely, leaving behind a pale, exhausted, but fundamentally human teenager. His clothes were ragged, his knuckles bleeding, but his eyes were his own again, tired, clear, and unclouded by the abyss. Elias slowly pushed himself up into a sitting position, his gaze sweeping across the cavernous hangar. Vorden was stirring, groaning as he clutched his bruised ribs, and all around them, the 300 aged refugees were pulling themselves up from the cold floor. They were still old. Their hair was still white, their skin still lined with the 50 years Quinn had violently stolen from them. The horrific cost of their survival had not been magically washed away, nor would it ever be. But as they looked at the boy who had aged them, there were no screams of terror or demands for vengeance. An elderly woman, the same one who had looked at Elias with milky, dying eyes just minutes ago, placed a trembling, wrinkled hand over her steadily beating heart. She looked at Quinn, and she simply nodded. They understood the brutal arithmetic of the universe. They had paid the toll, and because of it, they were breathing. Elias looked at Quinn, the terrified judgment that had clouded the doctor's mind finally lifting. He had believed that the Golden Warrior's arrival had cursed them, exposing them to a universe too cruel to comprehend. But as Elias watched Quinn walk over to help Vorden to his feet, a profound, undeniable sense of hope took root in the medic's soul. The universe was indeed an unimaginably dangerous slaughterhouse, filled with alien armadas and ancient bloodthirsty gods. But humanity was no longer just meat waiting for the butcher. They had a shield, a flawed, scarred, and dangerous shield, who carried the weight of terrible sins so that the rest of them could sleep in the light. Elias Thorne, the cynical combat medic who had spent his life delaying the inevitable, finally smiled. The old world was dead, burned away by golden fire and dark magic. But as he looked up at the patched, scarred ceiling of the sanctuary, Elias knew they were ready for the new one. They had survived the irreversible step, and whatever nightmare dared to step out of the dark next, they would be waiting for it.